The other extreme is sort of, I think, of Jean-Paul Sartre is the existentialist extreme. That is where every moment of ordinary life is, so to speak, rife with the anxiety of the reflective philosopher. I don't think that's quite right either. But I certainly think that you need to, and I certainly hope I do, bring my philosophy home from the office, so to speak.
Welcome everyone to today's AMA, where we are very pleased to welcome Professor Philip Pettit. He is LS Rockefeller University Professor of Politics and Human Values at Princeton University and Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy at the Australian National University in Canberra. He has written at great depth and breadth on philosophical topics ranging from politics, ethics, philosophy of mind, philosophy of action, metaphysics, and more. His books include Republicanism, A Theory of Freedom in Government, Just Freedom, A Moral Compass for a Complex World, The Birth of Ethics, Reconstructing the Role and Nature of Morality, and many more. If I were to list out his many books and publications, we'd be here all day, so I won't do that. And feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Pettit.
Delighted.
Awesome. So there's a lot of stuff that I wanted to talk about, and I'd like to start by talking about freedom. And as I mentioned, one of the books you've written covers that topic, and you've written on it elsewhere as well. And so I take it that the conception you've defended is distinct in some ways, at least, from that typically talked about in sort of the philosophy of action. So your notion isn't really concerned with, say, the possibility of doing otherwise or connections to moral responsibility, maybe. Am I correct in this assessment, in that your freedom in this political sense is distinct from freedom in the usual purely philosophical sense? Or can you maybe elaborate on that?
Yes. No, I think of freedom in the social or, political sense as the extent to which you are unhampered by mainly other people and indirectly natural obstacles, whereas freedom in the sense of could have done otherwise is really the free will problem. I have written on both, actually, and I do think there are connections, but I see them as quite distinct issues. I mean, just to see it, for example, on free will, someone might be a determinist who thought that free will was an illusion. I'm not one of those, incidentally, but someone might think that and yet think that it was important to think about social freedom and how far, even though we're constrained, as a determinist might think, a hard determinist might think we're constrained by the physical antecedents of our actions, they still might think that it's important that we each have a space allowed by other people, where they at least do not interfere. So we're able to go our own way, so to speak, under the neurophysical determinants, as they will think of them. So you could be a determinist about free will, think it's an illusion, and yet think that social freedom is really an important topic in political and moral philosophy.
Right. Interesting. So we could have the sort of political freedom or freedom as you talk about it, and yet not have free will in the usual sense. So they're kind of independent in that way. But you kind of suggested that there's some connection between them. What would that be?
Well, yes, although that takes, I think that on different views of each, there may be no connection between them. On the views that I adopt of each, there's at least some connection, although it's not very tight, to be honest. But maybe we could talk about that later if you wish.
Sure. So just briefly, I guess on the free will question, then we'll come. I have more questions specifically about freedom. On free will, you said you think it's not some sort of illusion. Do you think we have free will in the sort of libertarian sense? Or are you more of a compatibilist, or what's your sort of general approach on free will?
I'm a naturalist in the sense of thinking that things are pretty well at the basic level, as science gives us a good inkling that they are, governed by either deterministic cause or perhaps by indeterministic chance. But I think that despite that naturalism, as you might call it, whether it be determinist or indeterminist in character, and of course that involves thinking that we ourselves are part of that natural world governed by those either deterministic or indeterministic laws, I think that despite all of that, despite of our being located there as part of that material world, we still enjoy something that's worth describing as free will.
Right. So it is sort of a compatibilist approach in that sense.
Absolutely.
It's not
compatibilist. Of course,
yeah, I think
I should say something more about how I think of free will in order to vindicate that view, of course.
Right, sure. I'm very much on the same page as far as that goes. I tend to think that, well, determinism and determinism is sort of a scientific question, not really relevant to our sort of everyday choices of whether we think we're free in our actions or not. It just seems completely irrelevant to me. Is that sort of one thing that you would agree with, or do you think?
Yes, but I think the big issue is in explaining, as it were, why it's not relevant. I mean, why both the scientific image of the human being and the manifest image of the human being, as Wilfrid Sellars used to call them. In the manifest image, we enjoy free will. In the scientific image, it looks like everything is either predetermined in a deterministic picture of the world or with some chance thrown in. But of course, even if chance is responsible for what happens, that doesn't give us free will. But maybe I should say a little bit about what the core of my thinking about free will. Okay, so I think the core idea that needs to be vindicated in any account of free will that's realistic, compatibilist or indeed incompatibilist, is the idea that for various things you do, it can be true, as we put it after the event, that you could have done otherwise. This wasn't, so to speak, something that we don't hold you responsible for because you couldn't do otherwise. No, we think in many, many cases that what you did, as we say, you did of your own free will, and so you could have done otherwise. Now think of those two notions, the notion of you did it of your own free will, and it's being true after the event that you could have done otherwise. And the core issue really in thinking about free will is how to square that notion that you could have done otherwise with either a causal determinist or a chance indeterminist view of the natural world and of us within the natural world. And in approaching that, and I have to say that my work here is in good part supported. I mean, we've done work jointly with Victoria McGeer, but I start from, and it seems like taking quite a few steps away from the topic, but I'll get back to the topic quickly if you'll give me some indulgence. Think about the way in which we human beings exhort one another all the time. So I say to you, let's suppose, Troy, you are facing a situation where it's difficult to tell the truth. Maybe you're being interviewed by a committee and the issue is whether or not you were involved in some, I don't know, let it be prior political movement or something. And I say to you before, and we talk about it, and we agree that you ought to tell the truth, that the reasons stack up in favor of telling the truth. And I may say to you, look, you ought to tell the truth, maybe as I think you're faltering. I exhort you, and then I say, when I say you ought to tell the truth, of course, I'm implying that you can tell the truth, that it's within your capacity. And I may say in exhorting you, either you ought to tell the truth, or you can tell the truth. I can the focus on the ought or on the can. But notice this is a very interesting speech act, a very interesting sort of form of address towards another person. I'm ascribing to you a capacity. I say, you can do this, describing the capacity to tell the truth. But I'm not describing it in the way in which I might ascribe a certain height to you by saying you're 5'10" height, Troy, or whatever you are. And that's a purely descriptive ascription in the sense that the truth conditions of the sentence, you are 5'10" in height, are determined, they're realized or not, quite independently of what I say your height is. Call that a descriptive report. Of course, the big traditional contrast with the descriptive report is a performative report, as it were. Suppose I'm your boss and I say to you, and I'm authorized to do this, I say, Troy, you're fired. That not only, as it were, gives information about the truth condition that you don't have a job anymore, but it makes it the case that you don't have a job anymore. It brings about the truth condition. Now, I want to say that an exhortation, when I say you can tell the truth, comes somewhere between a descriptive and a performative. It's what I call an evocative. So when I say you can tell the truth, Troy, it's the truth condition is that you have this capacity that I'm ascribing to you. But I say that because I think that saying it to you and reminding you of the reasons, they'll be implied if I just say you can, say for telling the truth, I assume that this makes it more likely that you will have that ability. It scaffolds the ability, so to speak. It makes it more likely that you will actually tell the truth. My reminding you of the considerations, my reminding you of the fact that perhaps you're committed to them, and it can actually lift your capacity to act on them. That's what an exhortation is. Now, here's the really interesting thing. And I know we're still a bit away from the free will topic, but I will come back, I promise you. Here's the interesting thing, that suppose that you don't actually tell the truth. You come out of the committee meeting and I say, well, and you say, oh God, I didn't tell them the truth. They asked me, but I vagued it up or whatever. Now, at this point, of course, I may think that you had, as we say, an excuse, something like that someone had threatened you with real trouble if you did this or whatever it might be, or that you had a momentary sort of lapse of memory and you forgot about this. I may think that, but in all likelihood, I probably don't think there was an excuse of that kind. And of course, I wouldn't have exhorted you ex ante before the event. I wouldn't have said, you can tell the truth. If I thought you were subject to that sort of coercion or physical incapacity or whatever that might stop you, when I exhort you, I assume that there are no excuses of that familiar kind present. So what am I going to say after the event when you come out and admit to me shamefacedly that you failed to tell the truth? Well, of course, I may think that I was all wrong about you. I may think, oh God, this guy is a pathological liar, as it were. I was just wasting my breath by exhorting him. I may think that, but again, I think that's unlikely as well. I think what's much more likely is this, that I still think you as someone who might have been brought over the line, who might have been successfully exhorted to tell the truth, where it was just a fluke or a contingency that the exhortation failed. Now, what am I going to say to you in that case? I'm adopting towards you now, after the failure, the same attitude as I had towards you before the failure, when I said, you can tell the truth. But now if I want to adopt that same attitude ex post, after the actual action, aren't I going to say, Troy, you could have done otherwise. You could have told the truth. And when I'm doing it, I'm saying it in the spirit of a sort of retrospective exhortation. I'm saying to you, Troy, you are an exhortable person. You are someone within the reach of this sort of exhortation that we human beings routinely practice with one another. Now, that's how I think that the notion of you could have done otherwise gets to be vindicated within a hortatory or an exhortatory perspective. Of course, if I hadn't been there to exhort you beforehand, I might still say after the event, Troy, you could have told the truth, thinking that, well, you were exhortable. Anyone could have exhorted you. Not more than that. I'm going to assume about you that you know what exhortation is. You, like me, exhort other people on occasion. So I know that you're capable of exhorting yourself, of reminding yourself of the reasons, of reminding yourself, I can do this. I can do this. And given that that exhortation, so to speak, was possible ex ante before the event by yourself, I want to say ex post after the event, you could have told the truth, meaning that your capacity for self-exhortation is something I continue to ascribe to you. I regard you as someone that can be, so to speak, brought in line with these standards. You're one of us. You know, you're not a pathological liar. You're not of a totally different disposition, you know, indifference towards the truth or whatever. You're one of us. You're responsive for these reasons. And I'm just continuing to remind you, and perhaps, of course, with a view to your future behavior, I want to say you could have told the truth. Don't give up on yourself. I'm not giving up on you. That's the message. Now, I think the notion of free will is the notion of acting on the basis of the sorts of reasons. There may be moral reasons, there may just be social reasons, even prudential reasons. But I think free will as being responsive to those sorts of considerations in this self-exhortative mode, in a mode that parallels within the self the attitude, the address that we adopt with other people when we exhort them. We take about each of us to be capable of self-exhortation, and we hold one another responsible. We say, you could have done otherwise, in cases where you actually fail to live up to what I take to be shared standards shared between us.
Awesome. That was great. Yeah, a bunch of questions spring to mind, but I don't want to spend too much time on this before moving on to some other things. I was wondering, so one of the key components there is that sort of responsiveness to reasons. Is that sort of the key component to an action being free, that you're sort of responsive to reasons when you perform it, or something like that?
I think it is, and there's a large family of views, of course, that associate free will with reasons responsiveness, and I'm certainly part of that family. But I think that the emphasis on exhortation and the fact that it enables us after the event, entitles us, so to speak, almost requires us to say you could have done otherwise with someone we treat as having been exhortable effectively. That really gives you the key, because just reasons responsiveness on its own won't explain why we say after the event of someone who didn't act on the reasons that they could have done otherwise. This is why the exhortatory aspect of it is crucial.
Right, and that exaltation as a speech act, could that maybe be construed, maybe to use Searle's terminology, as a sort of assertive with this intended perlocutionary effect of getting the person to act in a certain way, causing them to act in a certain way?
Exactly. That's why I was describing it as an evocative. Let me just say one thing more on the sort of the image of, say, take a libertarian view. The libertarian view is that maybe natural causes or chances or whatever, grind their inexorable way towards producing in your brain or whatever this bit of behavior that will constitute this action. But on the libertarian view, the view that is inconsistent with the naturalism, with the claim that that is all there is to say about a human being at that level, the libertarian says, over and beyond that, so to speak, natural chain of causation or chance, you have the agent who steps in with this non-natural power, called free will on this libertarian view, who decides to go this way rather than that way, in a sense, who sort of controls the natural chain of causation or chance. Now, the interesting thing about the view, the reasons responsive view, I would say in general, but particularly with this exhortatory twist to it, is that it suggests that is still a sort of structure that's there even within a compatibilist vision. Because in the picture that I was giving you, sure, of course, my beliefs, my desires, my intentions, my wishes, they all bubble up within me, and presumably they've got a neurophysical form, and, they're pushing me towards this, that, or the other action. But the fact that I'm a self-exhortating, exhorting agent who's learned exhortation as a social act and has interiorized that social act means that I am a source of another type of input into the causal chain that leads to action. And that input is the input of reminding me of various reasons to which I am presumably responsive in general, making sure they're in the channel, so to speak, of causation, and making sure ideally that they're the ones that are satisfied in the direction that I actually take. Now, the interesting thing here is that whereas the bubbled up sort of beliefs or desires or whatever that would issue naturally in action without thinking about it, well, they're really something within myself. I'm the sort of arena where they operate, like, a simple animal. And my pet dog is the arena of all sorts of impulses and insights and observations that take him this direction or that. We're all like that too. But the fact that we have this new stream of self-exhortation means that we have something that's akin to what the libertarian imagines as a non-natural sort of force that supervenes on, comes down on, intervenes in the natural causation. We have this self-exhorting sort of stream of reasons giving. Now, the really interesting thing, it seems to me, of that picture is that exhortation, social exhortation, is clearly an act that I perform as a human being with another human being. I am personally responsible. I act as a responsible, as a person, as a responsible agent in exhorting someone. And of course, I could be blamed for exhorting them or praised for exhorting them, but it's something that I do as a person. Now, in the same way, self-exhortation, as in reminding myself of the reasons or just insisting on, I can do it, Philip, come on, that is an act of me as a person. And so when I, so to speak, can inject these exhortatively mobilized considerations, standards, reasons, leading me to go on one way rather than another, in virtue of doing that, I as a person take a certain sort of charge over what occurs by my hands, over the action that I perform. So I don't know whether that helps, but that's partly why in the free will literature, it's very important that the agent is always held to be the author of the action, to take up the theme of Harry Frankfurt's in particular. It's mine, I own it, I authorize it. Libertarians really think that they're the only ones can vindicate that. But on this picture, I am the source of this exhortation or self-exhortation that puts these reasons into the chain of causation. And to that extent, it is I who am the source of the action. I own what I do as a result.
Right, and that can be so even if your so doing has some prior cause to it. Because I know some libertarians would think that if there is some prior cause or prior determining cause of that exaltation or whatever, then it wasn't really a free choice.
Well, the libertarian has a real problem, it seems to me, because the libertarian, on the one hand, wants to say I can live with a deterministic picture of nature of the world, and yet says that I have this extra power of intervening in that directing in some way that natural chain of cause or chance. And it's very hard to see how that fits, because if you really are a determinist, then I wave to someone, well, that's a physical action, my arm goes up, etc., etc. And if you really think that is the deterministic result of natural causes that are entirely independent of free will, then it's hard to see what role free will is playing as this extra non-natural element that leads me to wave at the friend that I see in the distance. On the picture that I have, the reasons that I put into the chain of causation leading up to the action, those reasons themselves are part of the natural chain of causation, because they are realized by presumably neural configurations within my head. And what happens is that I, who have learned this social skill of exhortation, internalize it as a skill of self-exhortation. And what I'm doing is, I'm not, so to speak, thwarting nature, putting a sort of input into the causation of action independent of the natural inputs. No, I'm activating other natural impulses, call them the exhortatively mobilized ones, if you like, side by side with those that maybe were there already. And so what does result is a result of the package of this exhortation combined with whatever was there prior to the exhortation. And of course, if someone fails and we think they're still exhortable, and we say, you could have done otherwise, what we're doing really is holding up an ideal for them. Don't give up. You can still claim this control over what you do. You can still be responsive to these reasons that you care about. Don't give up on that.
Awesome. Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff there, and I'd like to explore it some more, except I also want to move on to some other topics, if that's all right with you. And in particular, I want to move on to talking more about freedom and the way that you've talked about it. And so you've construed your approach as one primarily concerned with non-domination, right? You're free to the extent that you're not dominated in your choices. Maybe you could expand on this a little bit. And then I was also wondering if it's right to think about freedom in this way as a kind of a matter of degree, right? We're more or less free depending on how much we, or a group or whatever, is dominated. But it's not really useful in general to talk about whether we are free or unfree, sort of simpliciter. Do you agree with this? Does it seem right to you?
Yeah, so maybe I should give a little picture of the view I like and where it fits within rival views, and then come back to that matter of degree.
Sure.
Where I actually do feel sympathetic with what you've said. So I think that there are three pictures of social freedom in the literature, which are really the central pictures to get a sense of, it seems to me. The first is this view that you get it in Hobbes, but I think many economists actually, as a matter of fact, sign up to it without realizing. And on that view, look, when are you free in a choice? Well, you're told on this first view, any choice, of course, involves various options. Options are possibilities that you can realize. Of course, the theory of free will is relevant to what does it mean to say you can realize this option or that option. But now we put the free will issue aside. We assume that there's some story to be told about what it is for something to be an option. Now, on this first view of social freedom, you're free in a choice just to the extent to which you're able to enact that option which you actually come to prefer. So you might have an option between doing X, Y, or Z, depending on what you prefer. Maybe you come to prefer X. You're free in that choice, as we say after the event, if you actually manage to do X. That's called freedom, at least I call that freedom as non-frustration. So basically, you're free in a choice if your actual preference isn't satisfied. Now, Isaiah Berlin, I think, did great work in criticizing that view. It's a view that you find most clearly in Hobbes, although amazingly, Berlin himself doesn't seem to recognize that. He doesn't think of it as a Hobbesian view, though it is very explicitly in Hobbes. So Berlin has this sort of argument against it. He says, look, on this view of freedom, you can make yourself free by just changing your preferences, by adapting your preferences. So give an example. Suppose I'm in prison for maybe a couple of months or whatever, but I would really like to be, I'd like to be outside. I'd like to be able to live in the open world. If in that sort of case, then I find I'm unfree, because my actual preference, which is to live a free life, is being frustrated by the fact that I'm living in this prison. Okay, but then I think, well, wait a moment, I've read about freedom, I've picked up this Hobbesian view, and I realized that if only I stopped wanting to live outside, if only I could adapt my preferences so that I want to stay in prison, then suddenly I'd be free, because after all, my actual preference would now be being satisfied, wouldn't it? And so on this view, you could make yourself free even though you're in prison and want to live outside by, reminding yourself, gee, prison isn't so bad. It'll be nice to have a roof over my head, to be fairly warm and so on, and to be sure of having a bed to rest in and so on. And I think about these things and, suddenly, well, it's not so bad. Maybe I actually prefer spending these months in prison. At that point, I become free. Now, Berlin rightly says this is slightly absurd. Whatever our notion of social freedom or political freedom is, you can't make yourself free just by changing your options. Okay, so Berlin introduced a second view of thinking about freedom in response to his own criticism, which is what he called the open doors view. On the first view of freedom, if you think of each option as a door, then on the first view, freedom as non-frustration, you are free just so long as the door you push on happens to be open. What Berlin argues instead, and really I think impressively, is that in order for the choice to have been free, it's got to have been the case that each of the options defining the choice was an open door, that had you pushed on it, you could have gone through that door as well as the door you actually preferred and pushed on. And he calls that an open doors view of freedom. Now, the third view of freedom that I see as particularly salient here in a social political context is the one I call freedom as non-domination. You might call that second view, as I've done, freedom as non-interference. On this third view, well, let's introduce it with the doors metaphor. Imagine it's the case that you have an important choice. Let's suppose it's whether or not to speak at a certain meeting, or to deliver a message to your member of Congress or Parliament or whatever. And imagine it's the case that each option on the face of it seems to be open, but there is, as you might call it, a doorkeeper. And if the doorkeeper, before you, so to speak, make your choice, or after you try to make your choice, decides he doesn't much like you, or, she doesn't much like you, and slams the door in your face. Well, if you're subject to the goodwill of a doorkeeper in that way, then you might think you're not really free. So, for example, suppose I can deliver a letter to my member of Congress, and I'm said I can put it there for this member of Congress or another place or whatever, and all options are open, or of course I don't have to at all. But it turns out that whether or not I can lodge the letter, whether or not it'll be received or taken in, just depends on the mood of it might literally be the doorkeeper, And in that case, you'd wonder, well, am I really free to protest to my member of Parliament, Congress, or not? Given that whether or not I can actually do it is going to depend on how a doorkeeper feels about it in advance. Now, I'm inclined to think that that we really should think of a choice as being properly free only if not only are all the doors in the choice open, but there's no doorkeeper hanging around who might slam any door in your face, so to speak, should you try to use it. So I'll give an example. Say, take freedom of speech. In our society, in my society, it may well be that I can, stand up and denounce some movement or praise some movement or whatever it might be. I've got freedom of speech, it appears. Make it a local context if you like. Maybe it's a workplace type context where I can protest against management or back management on some issue that's come to the shop floor, as it were. But suppose it's the case that while, this is plastered up all over the place, that you can do this or that, and you must feel free, and these are all open options for you. But suppose it's the case that actually, whether or not I am allowed to speak, I'm allowed to lodge the protest, or allowed to lodge the vote of support, or whatever it might be for management, depends on just the whim, as it were, of some go-between. That go-between will be a doorkeeper. And I don't really enjoy freedom of speech if I can say what I wish, protest or support, for example, only if that doorkeeper is happy that I should say what I wish. If that's the case, then it's not my will that's in charge of whether I protest or support. It's rather the doorkeeper's will, because I can act on my will, as I wish, only if the doorkeeper is willing to let me act as I wish. Now, I think this view of freedom, it means that, look, I'm really free in a choice only if there isn't a dominus in my life, a master in this choice, whatever it might be. Actually, that was a Latin word, of course, for a master, dominus, and the Romans are very keen on this notion. They describe the relationship between a master and the slave as one of dominatio, which I translate as domination. And they emphasize that if there's a master there who can intervene if he or she wishes and stop you doing this, that, or the other, then you suffer dominatio. You don't enjoy what they call libertas, or freedom. And I think we can make that very vivid in a current context. In the little book, Just Freedom, I just mentioned this example because I think it makes the point more vivid. I talk about the play A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen, where just at the beginning of the play, you've got the young banker, Torvald, and his wife, Nora, and they live in a time and country, Norway, when women do not have the same rights as men, and that men can determine, how far they go outdoors, what they wear, who they associate with, whether they go to the theater, what church they attend, and so on. But in this play, just to pick that couple, Torvald absolutely dotes on Nora, and he wants to give Nora carte blanche, an open sort of slather of choice. And so, this isn't explicit in the play, I'm building on the idea. He more or less says, look, wear what you like, eat what you like, associate with whom you will. Let's go to the theater if you wish. Let's go out with your friends if you wish. You are a free agent, he says to her. Now, so in all the range of choices associated with her sort of life and that sort of culture, she has open doors, open doors, open doors, open doors. It's perfect sort of freedom, a la Berlin, freedom as non-interference. But of course, Torvald is still the boss. He's actually a very gentle, a kind boss. He's in love with her, he dotes on her, as I said. But it's still the case that should Torvald turn against her, or should Torvald, decide, well, I don't much like my wife being seen at this church or that theater, whatever. Should he turn against her, then of course, he'd be in a position to stop her. So what she does in all this apparently range of free choice, what she does is always subject to his will. It's his will that's really in control. If she's free, as it were, to act on her will, that's only because that's his will. And the idea I've tried this in many audiences in various contexts in various countries, is Nora free just by virtue of the fact that Torvald is so nice to her? And almost invariably students always scream, absolutely not. Now, if you think that Nora is not free in that situation, then I suggest you are thinking, as I do, that in order to be free, you've got to not just not be interfered with. After all, Nora is not interfered with. It's also got to be the case that you're not dominated, that there's no one in a position of a dominus in your life. I took too long over that. I'm sorry, Troy, but I hope it.
No, that's excellent. Yeah, it's a great explanation. And so I think my original, so I was wondering if you could expand on that, and then I had this question about the sort of degree of domination. Do we think right? Yeah.
Very good. This way of thinking about freedom, just to put a bit of history in place, is indeed associated with the Roman Republic. They all argued, for example, that the slave with the kindly master, someone in a position akin to Nora's, was not free. And they made a political ideal of this. They said a citizen should enjoy freedom in relation to other citizens, private non-domination as well, but also in relation to the state itself. The state that lays down the law that protects each citizen from other citizen. It itself had better not be a dominator, it better enjoy public non-domination as well as private. And they argued that you'd get that if you had, well, it's a variety of democracy, really. They called it a mixed constitution where power is divided up into different bodies and citizens can vote in all sorts of ways and protest and so on. Let's not look into the detail there, but that was their notion of private and public freedom. And that started what came to be known, or is known in the longer tradition, as the Republican way of thinking. Not the GOP way of thinking, alas, but it is the way of thinking that recurs in Europe in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance period, in the time of the English Revolution in the 17th century. It's this great Kachkai of freedom. In that sense of non-domination that really matters in that revolution, that war in the 1640s in Britain. And of course, it's that way of thinking that is absolutely at the center of the American War of Independence in the 1770s, and I would say to slightly lesser extent, but also in the French Revolution of 1789. Now, on this way of thinking, this traditional Republican way of thinking about freedom, it's true that they tended to make it an on or off matter. And they tended to say, look, a person is free or they're unfree, period. And I think that is something that we need to rectify if we're going to, as it were, update this way of thinking about freedom, as I want to do. And I think that in updating it, you can see that, well, first of all, let's suppose we say that someone is a free person to the extent to which they can exercise the same choices as other people in the society without interference from other people, and that they're free just to that extent. Now notice that people might vary in the extent to which they can exercise the same choices as others. Some might be much more able to do it than others, in which case freedom is not enjoyed equally. Some have a lower degree of freedom. But equally, some may be curtailed in, maybe to the same extent, but in more choices than others. So, for example, maybe someone who's a regular blue-collar worker might be subject to all sorts of constraints under employment law, for example, the constraint of being fired at the will of the manager, which others are not subject to. And to that extent, that worker is going to depend on the goodwill of the manager or the employer not to fire him or her. So that's again going to be in the range of choices. There's going to be a degree of variation between people, and there's going to be an image of whether you can be more free rather than less free in terms of non-domination. And there are other respects too in which freedom as non-domination is going to come in degrees. For example, just to mention one, I've talked interfere with your choice. Well, there are different ways of interfering in a choice. And if you are free to the extent to which there aren't others, that in certain choices others are not able to interfere with you, well, interfere may mean block you from choosing the option, any option, or it may just mean penalize an option, as in, if you do it, you've got to suffer a penalty. That's also interference. And of course, some such forms of interference are much more radical than others. So that's another way in which there's a degree written into this way of thinking about social freedom. I think of this ideal of social freedom, Republican freedom as non-domination, as an ideal that we as a society or to try to achieve, so far as possible, equally for every citizen, both in their relations with other citizens, which is going to require, of course, a structure of law to protect each more or less equally, but also that it's a sort of freedom they should enjoy equally in relation to the government that lays down the laws that protect them from other citizens, so that they have a democratic sort of equality in access to government. Government's not controlled by just those with the money, those on the inside, those with clout, those of a certain sort of ethnicity or whatever it might be. I think this ideal of equal freedom as non-domination, as an ideal of justice for a society as a whole. And that, of course, presupposes the notion that it comes in degree, and what you want to do is to lift that degree as far as possible for as many people as possible, ideally for all citizens.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. I had another question related to freedom here. And you've talked about and proposed various tests for sort of whether an individual or group or nation or whatever is dominated by some other. And you've called these, roughly the eyeball test, the tough luck test, the straight talking test. And I found these interesting, but I wonder though whether one of these features or another, whether it's a good sign of domination depends on contingent features of human behavior. For example, it could have been or might be in some societies that unfree individuals or groups or so forth tend to behave in ways that pass the eyeball test. And I take it that this isn't something that's ruled out. And would we have to develop different tests of freedom in such societies or counterfactual scenarios? Or what do you think about this concern?
Yeah, that's a great issue. And it's also, it's one that troubles me a bit. So let me say what I think. Maybe I should explain what I think of, say, the eyeball test. I think the eyeball test is a test. You want to know of a society. Are people in this society, do they generally enjoy and experience freedom as non-domination equally in relation to one another? How are you going to know this? Now, of course, it'd be lovely if we could quantify it and had a mathematical index, an economic index of how far, but that's very, very hard to get. I'm not sure you ever could get it, but here's a rough and ready test, I think, that we can all understand, at least in our sort of culture. And I'll come to your issue about cultural variation in a moment, which is to say, look, if you're in a society where people really enjoy this equal freedom as non-domination in relation to one another, social freedom, if you like, then what's going to be true is that no one has a reason for fear or deference based on the interfering power of others. And to that extent, no one has a reason, everyone is able to look others in the eye. The test is, can people in this society generally look one another in the eye without reason for fear or for deference, without reason for cowering and keeping out of the way, or without reason for deferring, ingratiating, placating, trying to win the goodwill of that other person, where this is based on the power of interference. Now, sometimes, of course, we are going to defer to others who are in a position to give us a great gift or whatever it might be. But I'm thinking of where this is based on their power of just interfering with us. Now, I think of that as a very intuitive sort of test. And the interesting thing is it recurs in that Republican tradition I've talked about. For example, John Milton, a great Republican thinker of the 1650s, talked about the free society as a society where people can walk holding their head on high. They would have to doff their cap to others. They don't have to bend the knee, It's pretty well. They can look one another in the eye without reason for fear or deference. Just very briefly, I won't talk about the other tests, but I think of the tough luck test as the test for determining whether we have political freedom vis-a-vis the powers that lay down the law, And the straight talk test is a test whether one country is free in relation to other countries. But let's put those aside and come back to your question about freedom as the eyeball test. So people have said to me, look, don't you realize that, for example, in a certain Chinese tradition, Confucian type tradition, it's really important that you defer to the elderly, to the, those who are in authority and so on. And does your view actually resonate with that view, or does it rather not conflict with it? Well, and I can say for us, I've presented these views in various parts of China and Southeast Asia. And the interesting thing I find is that with a few comments, people are quickly won over to it. The main comment I make is that, look, it's one thing to, as it were, as a matter of grace or virtue, defer to others, the elderly, those who know more than you, whatever it might be. But it's another thing to be forced, for fear of your own health or safety, so to speak, to have to defer to them. And the Confucian tradition is, after all, an ethical tradition of saying how we ought to behave. But if you're forced to defer by the weakness of your position, by the fact that these are big and you're small, the fact that these have this power over you, that is asymmetrical, favors them, if you have to defer for those reasons, then, so to speak, the ethics isn't even worth thinking about. You have no choice but to defer. And when the Confucian argues that we ought to show this deference towards various others, then he, I would say, or she is supposing that we actually aren't forced to do that. That's why it's a matter of ethical virtue to do it. And I find that comment quickly wins, even the Confucians on side. So I think that the eyeball test works against that tradition. There is another sort of strand which is more problematic, I think, which is that it's sometimes said, I must say, it's very hard to find a full defense of this that I found persuasive, but it's sometimes said that, for example, various indigenous people take looking in your eye to be a very hostile act, rather than, something that we think of as open and creating relationships and so on. Indeed, there's even, I have to say, a certain sort of English person who, it seems to me, doesn't much look you in the eye. I remember, if I can interrupt myself, Raymond Williams years ago. I'm Irish by background, as my voice probably reveals. I remember many years ago, Raymond Williams, the great English literary theorist, was in Dublin giving a lecture. And I remember he said to an Irish audience, he was asked what a folkway was. And he said, well, it's something like, I guess a folkway in Northern European countries like our own is that one whereby you don't look the other person in the eye too much. And the Irish audience simply broke into laughter because, of course, the Irish tradition, and maybe I'm reflecting that in my preference for the eyeball test, is very much a tradition of meeting the other person eye to eye, as it were. Now, if there are cultures where, so to speak, you really don't look the other person in the eye except in a hostile way, then I guess the test doesn't work there. But there's surely an analogous sort of test that will work. And I still think of the spirit of the eyeball test is going to carry over, because in any culture, we know what it is to have reason to defer or to fear another person because of your relative weakness. And the real test is that you're not suffering that sort of weakness in relation to the other. And if people in general do not suffer that sort of weakness, if the criminal law, if tort law, if contract law, if employment law, if this whole range of laws, domestic law, and the norms that support those laws are such that no one is exposed to that sort of, at least high degree of power on the part of another that would force them to feel fear or deference, then that's as good a test, I think, as any of whether or not in that society people enjoy freedom equally as non-domination.
Great. Yeah, that makes sense. It seems like, okay, maybe there are some, or at least very least could have been some that this wasn't the best test for, but we could develop something similar, or something that might fit the need of signaling this sort of effect.
Yes.
Yeah. So we had this question also on non-domination from Kalisti. And they mentioned, yes, non-domination involves others not being able to interfere with you at their pleasure without tracking your interests or without your control. What does this ability amount to? For most of the solutions you propose, to be effective in increasing non-domination, ability to interfere with you at their pleasure has to be limited by, for example, legal threats coming at you, coming along with interference, or the ability for retaliation. That's where we get to alien control. They're not sure whether this really decreases the ability of arbitrary interference, though, or whether it decreases the attractiveness of arbitrary interference. Do you understand what they're getting at there?
Well, I think that there's one larger issue, and maybe you can come back at me if you think I haven't addressed it. Or
sure.
Is it Christy you said if he or she thinks I haven't addressed it? I think the larger issue. I'm sorry, I've lost track for just a moment. So the question was, yes, about law. So the larger issue is really the relationship between law and freedom. Now, John Locke, who's regarded as a great liberal hero after all, and someone I deeply admire, he is actually very closely enmeshed with this Republican way of thinking that I've described, despite the fact of his being retrospectively co-opted, as it were, to neoliberal type circles. But Locke said, for example, where there is no law, there is no liberty. And his image was precisely the one that I share, which is that if in order to be free, you've got to be secured against the possibility of interference by others, you can't depend on just their goodwill for not being interfered with. And if we want freedom to be equally available to all, then it's only law, and I would say the support of norms in a decent society that are going to go with suitable laws. It's only laws that are going to empower each sufficiently in relation to others, for example, that they can't be pushed around and that they don't live in fear of deference. So let's take the example of employment. My own view is that if someone is in a situation where they can be fired at the will of a manager or an employer, then to that extent, that person is almost certainly dominated, because in most economic contexts, it's very difficult to lose a job, even if it's high employment, there are very heavy transaction costs and so on. And so you've got this power of firing that really means that I, the employee, am subject to the will, so to speak, of this employer as to whether he or she is going to fire me at will. And if I've no recourse whatsoever, should they fire me, then I'm totally exposed to that. Now, most societies, many at least democratic societies, do have protections on this front, unlike the right to fire at will being made sacrosanct. And the protections may simply be that if a manager or an employer wants to fire someone, there's a procedure you go through to establish that they've been shirking or not doing the bit or whatever it might be. That may be a procedure that's established under law, or it may be just a procedure established under an agreement between the union and the management or whatever it is. But having that protection there, legal protection or the protection available under the local customs or norms of the union in place, that protection means that while, of course, people can be fired, and often deserve to be fired, no doubt, no one is living in that situation of just being under the thumb of a manager who just might take against them. if they are, they're bound to feel fear, perhaps, and a reason to defer, to keep the manager sweet, so to speak. So I think it's really important in that way that law or norm is there to protect that sort of person. Now, that's true, I think, across the range of social life, in the workplace, in the public place, in the home, the domestic context, in all sorts of contexts. It's really important that we each operate in, so to speak, a force field that's established by supportive norms and laws that give each of us a certain anti-power, as you might call it, a certain security in relation to others. And it's only when we have that security, we don't depend on the goodwill of others for just leading a normal life, exercising the normal choices as we will. It's only then that we enjoy social freedom. Now, the tradition of thinking about freedom that replaced the Republican one, which was in the early 19th century called classical liberalism, and it's more or less exactly as neoliberalism is today, or libertarianism, it chooses rather to think that law is itself, that freedom pre-exists law. And that's because they think of freedom as non-interference, and think of law as being a way in which our native, natural freedom as non-interference is actually reduced by the interference of the law, as it might be by the interference of other people. That's quite a different way of thinking about freedom. Which is the better way of thinking about freedom? Freedom as non-domination or freedom as non-interference? I don't think there's a very simple answer to that. I think the answer to that, myself, of course, I remain committed to the notion of freedom as non-domination, the Republican approach and the old Republican approach, or I sometimes call it the neo-Republican approach. The reason I think it's the better way of thinking about freedom is that it gives us a better image of what justice is in a society. And what justice is going to be people enjoying private non-domination in relation to one another and public non-domination in relation to their government. Those are really the core sides of it. So I think it just gives us a much better theory than does the neoliberal theory that basically says, let the market rip. Let the state shrink to night watchman status and let the market take over. In my image, the market's really important, but it's equally important that the market and the law are in synergy with one another, with the law providing the protections and the regulations that enable the market and civil society to operate, where it itself, though, is a source of freedom, not a constraint on freedom, on this way of thinking.
Right. And so this user is also wondering, like, they're thinking of laws as things which might be used to disincentivize interference or domination or make it less attractive, but not something that actually disables it. So, so they might give us some kind of assurance that people won't interfere or dominate us in some of these ways. But there's still some difference between these laws being in place and someone, in fact, not being in a dominating position with respect to someone, because they might still not be persuaded to act in accordance with those laws. But does that make sense? Is that
absolutely? I mean, law is it's the only source, I would say, of our security on these fronts. Our security in the exercise of the choices we think of as the basic liberties that should be available equally to all. Law is our only protection, but of course it is a frail protection. Law can always be abused. For example, within the workplace, we have myriad examples worldwide, where there are laws that look pretty good, but they're just simply honored in the breach more than the observance, for example. Or if you have laws that really aren't supported by norms, within the society as a whole, or if you have, in order to have laws that really support people in their freedom, you've got to have people who are willing as citizens to join various, public interest groups and challenge what's happening and, speak up for how things ought to be, rather than sort of everybody disappearing into their own little nest, and and looking for their sort of private life in that nest. I think you've got to have an active citizenry to maintain an effective system of law that will actually help people to enjoy freedom as non-domination equally with one another.
Fair enough. So I wanted to move on to a couple questions about agency and group agency in particular. Agency, as you've construed it, involves and reasoning on the basis of beliefs and desires. And regarding belief, and I think desire, you've proposed that something can count as having a certain belief so long as it satisfies certain dispositional criteria. Is that correct, that this is something you defend, that dispositional features like these alone are sufficient for various intentional states?
Yes, because I'm fairly let's take the question, what is an agent? Now, of course, there are different answers to this question. I favor a very general sort of answer, which will include lots of animals, etc., as agents proper, and even robots as agents proper. And then I want to home in on a more exacting notion of agency that human beings enjoy. And this connects back with the notion of free will that I talked about at the very beginning. I think that's special to human beings for all sorts of reasons, mainly because we're social creatures of a kind that are mutually exhorting and self-exhorting. I think that is a huge difference. But if you pull back out, so to speak, let the camera pull back out and ask, what is an agent? Well, it seems to me, take something as simple, first of all, as a sunflower that follows the sun during the day. Now, you might say that the sunflower clearly got an inbuilt goal, which is to follow the sun. And it follows a form of action that actually leads it to realize that goal. It moves in the course of the day under various chemical inputs. But none of us is going to say that a sunflower is an agent. And that's because it has a goal and it adopts behaviors to realize the goal, but it doesn't pursue that goal in different scenarios or different situations. Now, if you have even a simple little robot, example I often use is, you've got a little robot on a tabletop, let's suppose, and on the tabletop are various bottles and glasses, some standing up, some on their sides, and you see this little robot, maybe with things that look a bit like eyes that quiver in front on the stalks. And these focus on an object on its side, and then its wheels begin to move towards that object, and then little levers or arms come out and raise the object. And once it's raised the object, it goes back into position of just having the maybe twirling and letting the stalks quiver. And again, if it fixates on something that is on its side, it goes and it lifts it up. Now, that's a very simple robotic mechanism that, like the sunflower, has got a single goal. The sunflower's is to follow the sun. The robot's is to put objects on this table that are on their side into an upright position. But the interesting difference between the two, and the reason why the robot, I would say, is an agent, but the sunflower is not, is that the robot has to pursue its goal across variations in its circumstances, with different glasses or bottles, with different sizes of glass or bottle. The glasses or bottles in this direction or at this distance or whatever. And it's got to adjust in each case. And so not only does it have to have a goal and a behavior that'll produce that goal, but it's got to have some representation of how things are in its environment, where the glass on its side is. Is it to the northwest? Is it at a meter distance or a meter and a half distance? And it's got to let that representation feed into how it behaves in order to realize a goal. Now, I say that what an agent is simply is a system that has goals to be realized, that forms representations reliably of the sort of circumstances it's in, and that acts appropriately to realize those goals according to its representations of the environment that it's in. And I think that's what an agent is. I think we human beings are agents of that kind. Of course, are very different from the robot, as all animals are, most animals are. All animals, and us in particular, have many more goals than one goal. We've got many bases on which to form representations, apart from quivering little eyes that are described at the end of the robot stalks. We've got other senses for a start. And of course, we human beings have the testimony of others. We share information. So we're very, very, very different in that way. But we still all fall within that category of agent. Now, what I've argued with, in particular with Christian List in the past, is that groups can be organized so that groups count precisely as agents of that kind. And I think, for example, a corporation or a church or an association or a club, any of these entities may be agents in that sense. Agents in the sense that for each you can identify a goal, and for each you can identify the judgments, so to speak, it forms, the representations it forms. It'll do that presumably on the basis of feedback from its individual members. But the members have to agree on a judgment, and they may disagree initially, so they've got to have some process for finding common judgments as well as the common goals. And then the members, or the members who are recruited to action, have to be disposed to be willing to cooperate with others in pursuing the group's goals according to the group's judgments. But once you have a group organized to do that, as any proper, so to speak, corporation, or as I say, church or university, or indeed government is going to be, then it in itself constitutes an agent. And it constitutes an agent different from the agents that are members of it, because while we each, the members, have our own beliefs and desires and act in a private capacity for the realization of our goals according to our representations in this or that context, we, so to speak, lend ourselves to the group agent in whose name we act when we agree, so to speak, to endorse the group judgments, even if it's not our personal judgment, and the group goals, and to then do whatever is required of us in order that we together realize those goals according to those judgments. So that's what I think of agency, Troy, and that's why I think it applies to group agents in particular.
Awesome, right. So, and not only do you argue that various groups satisfy agency in that sense, but you've also argued that I take it that some count as having a sort of co-awareness, of a propositional co-awareness at least. And your argument involves drawing on the fact that groups sometimes sort of reach verdicts on the basis of some sort of reasoning, and reasoning requires a sort of propositional co-awareness. Is this right? And do you construe co-awareness, propositional or otherwise, as something which doesn't require sort of qualitative experience or phenomenal experience?
Well, this really goes to the issue, and people have very, very different views on it, even among those who are realists of group agents, which I am. And that's the issue of how far a group has, so to speak, a consciousness of its own. Now, I think that groups do have to make judgments of their own as a group that may actually not systematically relate to the judgments they make as individuals. And the example I always like to give in order to explain this, suppose there are three of us. Here am I in the middle. I've got you, Troy, let's say on my right-hand side. I've got someone else, maybe Mary, on my left-hand side. And we decide that we want to pursue certain goals together. Maybe it's a little environmental body we want to establish or something on the local campus. And of course, we realize that in order to do this, we've got to form judgments and agree on various background things, as to, for example, which is most important, to collect rubbish on the campus or to proselytize about environmental issues or to take any variety of things. So we've got to make judgments in common. Now, here's a little simple example. Suppose there are three propositions we have to make a judgment about. One is whether P is the case. I'm sorry to go very philosophical. The philosopher's P. Another is whether Q is the case. And let's suppose another is whether P and Q is the case. By the way, this is a standard sort of decision. Think about a court that's got to decide in an issue of tort law whether, let's suppose, the defendant had a duty of care towards the plaintiff, the person bringing the tort action, and secondly, whether the person was negligent in exercising that duty of care so that the plaintiff was injured as a result. That's P and Q. And then the third issue they've got to decide is whether or not the plaintiff indeed should be held liable. And, the defendant held liable. And under most law, you'll be liable if P and Q, if it's the case that there was a duty of care and there was harm done. Anyhow, putting that aside, let's go back to the PQ and P and Q. You and I, Troy, we vote on this, let's suppose. And you and I may vote that P, but Mary here on my left votes against P. Still, there's a majority, and let's suppose we're operating majority voting, so the group agrees to judge that P is the case. Then we take the issue of whether Q is the case. Well, it may be that you disagree, you don't think Q is the case, but Mary and I think that Q is the case. That means, again, that two of the three, the majority, has voted for Q being the case, which means that it too gets up. But now we vote on whether or not P and Q is the case. But imagine, if you like, the court that has voted by majority that there was a duty of care, by majority that there was harm done. Now they face the judgment of whether or not there's liability, P and Q. Well, the really interesting thing, I call this the discursive dilemma. The really interesting thing is that when we vote on P and Q, Mary is going to vote against because she was against P. You're going to vote against Troy because you are against Q. I'm the only one who's going to vote P and Q. So as a group, we're going to vote it for P, the first two, for Q, the second two, but for not P and Q, because I'm the only one, you two are going to vote not P and Q. And so that means that if we're going to act together as a group, we have to, as we say, get our act together, and we've got to decide, for example, we might decide as a group that, okay, we'll go with P and Q. Maybe you and Mary are prepared to concede for the sake of making the group. Now, I think that's epitomizes what happens in the formation of any reliable group agent, that the members, so to speak, have to forego lots of their personal opinions in rallying behind the view gets established as the group view. Now, to that extent, the group becomes, well, I've once put it in, maybe it's going to extremes. I said that groups have minds of their own, because the members make up, so to speak, what the set of attitudes of the group is. They have to do that. Because the problem with the majority voting, in my simple case, it turns out that there are lots of theorems now in the literature. Actually, Christian List and I proved the first of them, according to which there is no systematic way of generating a reliably coherent group view out of coherent individual views that treats individuals as equals and takes each issue on its own terms, issue by issue, treats issues as equals too. So this is a major problem, and in order for groups to form, the group has to, in one sense, have a mind of its own. And then the issue is, well, does this mean that it's got a sort of center of consciousness? Now, I know you're referring to a paper that I wrote a couple of years ago. In general, I would say I'm skeptical about the notion of there being anything like a group consciousness. Certainly not a new center of consciousness, so to speak, because groups don't have sensations. Groups don't even have perceptions. They certainly form judgments and beliefs, but on the basis of the reports and ultimately the perceptions or whatever of their individual members. And so to that extent, they're not going to have the consciousness that goes with sensation or perception, obviously. But I think what is the case is that individuals, insofar as they have to, so to speak, get on in step with the group and almost sideline themselves, their own interests, their own lives in order to act for the group. That means that they are going to internalize, each one of them, a sort of sense of the group as us, as what we're identified with. And I think we enjoy, usually, many of us as individuals, that sense that we can identify with and share a sort of consciousness with others of being a single group, as well as having our individual consciousness. I think that's something that appeals greatly to people in belonging to churches or to political parties or to particular organizations, maybe universities or voluntary organizations or interest groups. We all enjoy that shared sort of awareness of a common purpose pursued with others, and in the pursuit of which we, so to speak, sideline ourselves. We take ourselves off the scene, and we act for the we rather than for the I. If I can just add a historical observation, there's some wonderful historical writing on the emergence of this way of thinking about groups in the Middle Ages, in the 1200s, 1300s mainly. And one interesting thing is that in a period where, for example, life was very short, I mean, the average lifespan might have been as 30, 35, in that period, people took great delight in having guilds and monasteries and a town and a church. And they saw it as a sort of way almost towards immortality in a way. You survived in the group because you were part of it, you were it. Now, group consciousness in that sense of identification with a center of agency in whose name you act, as well as the center of agency you as an individual constitute, I think that's important. But I don't think it's mysterious.
Awesome. So you've also talked about notions of justness and legitimacy. And I was wondering, I mean, those who care primarily or like entirely about the outcomes, or those prefer the utilitarian approach, may only care about just how the system is rather than sort of how legitimate it is, all else equal. What would you say to someone who had this view?
Well, I'm within ethics itself. I tend to be someone who's often called a consequentialist, but it's become a bad term, So I often say, well, I'm a consequentialist, but with a human face, because I think it's grossly misrepresented in many accounts of it, consequentialism. So what does a consequentialist think? Well, ultimately, what the consequentialist thinks is that the right thing for me, for anyone to do, for groups as well to do, and for states to do, for example, it depends really on the right thing to do is to produce the goods. In other words, to act in such a way that the good, assuming we've got now for the moment a sense of the good, that the good is thereby maximized or increased. Now, when I talk about the good, we, of course, will have different pictures of what is good, but I'm taking it here that all of us will agree we're talking about not just what is good for me, what is good, so to speak, relative to me as an agent, but we're talking about what is good more generally, or for people in general, for animals in general, for the world in general. We're talking about happiness, we're talking about peace, we're talking about social relationships of a productive, enjoyable kind. These are all part of the good. Okay, and so what I think in general, and this is very formulaic, is that the right is a function of the good in that sense. The right way to act is always that way, which produces the most good. But now immediately I have to qualify. And let me first of all qualify in a way that many hearers will be familiar with, drawing on an early essay by John Rawls called Two Concepts of Rules. And he asked about what a consequentialist should say about a system of justice. And he asks in particular, I should say that one form of consequentialist is someone who thinks the only good can be summed up in a single word, utility, where that may mean pleasure or something like pleasure. So he says, what is the utilitarian going to say about justice? Now, a lot of people without thinking might say, well, if we're all utilitarians, shouldn't the judges in making their judgments, for example, just simply want to make those judgments that will produce the most good overall? And won't that mean that each judge is going to become a law unto herself or himself? They're going to, so to speak, make a judgment. Well, in these circumstances, actually, if I let away this guilty person, they've already been hurt, say, in the course of the crime they committed or whatever. That person isn't going to commit any more crimes, and actually they're going to be happier and better off. So maybe I should let them off. And Rawls argues, he himself is no utilitarian, but he says, of course, no sensible utilitarian would think like that. Utilitarian would rather think about the practice of criminal justice and ask about what are the rules we should be laying down for the police, for the prosecutors, for the judges, for the juries, for the prison wardens and the prisons to follow if overall that criminal justice system, that set of practices, is going to produce the most good. And of course, it may be that in order to produce the most good, people within that practice are going to have to stick to pretty stiff briefs, so to speak, pretty demanding constraints. So, for example, plausibly, judges should not have the discretion to judge against the law. They should have to lay down sentences, and they should have to find guilt or innocence on the basis of the evidence and the jury's contribution or whatever on the basis of the law, and they should have to impose a sentence within the bounds established in the agreed law. And that's the way in which you're going to produce the best outcome, the most good in that criminal justice system. So that's just to say you can be a consequentialist, but yet think it's really, really important in a system like that people act according to constraints of the kind I mentioned with the judges. But another example is, you see, I think there are many, and this does depend on your theory of the good. I'm someone, for example, who thinks that friendship is part of the great good that we should be concerned with in human life. And now suppose I say, well, okay, I should act in a way that, of course, in general promotes the good, but including, and let's focus at the moment on it, the good of friendship and of my friends, therefore, with whom I have the relationship of friendship. Well, it's pretty clear that if you as a friend, for example, you say to me, okay, could you help me move an apartment at the weekend, for example? And I say to you something like, well, I'm a consequentialist, so hold on a moment. I've got to work out, is that the best possible thing I can do at the weekend? In terms of the good I might produce. And I begin to do calculations, The very fact that I hesitate like that, let alone calculate like that, shows you that I'm not a friend. In order to be a friend, you've got to be spontaneously disposed to say yes to a request like that. Of course, you don't have to get locked into doing whatever your friend asks you. I mean, the friend might ask you in the old joke to move a body rather than move apartment, And if a friend asks me to move a body, I don't have to just automatically do it spontaneously, given she's asked me. A red light goes on with a question like that. And the red light is, wait a moment, are there other goods than friendship that are really involved here? And I should be able to set the friendship aside when the red lights go on. But in general, though, in contexts where other friends make demands of me or requests of me, I should be disposed spontaneously to realize them. Else, I will not promote my friendship. So now what is this telling us? It's telling us that just as As a consequentialist, I say the judges should follow exact constraints in how they make their judgments. I say, as a consequentialist for whom friendship is a good, I should cultivate the disposition of friendship in myself, and I should be willing to just let it rip, to act out of that disposition, that spontaneous inclination, thereby realizing that's how I will promote this part of the good, friendship. But of course, I should always be on alert for red lights, which may indicate that perhaps there are other goods. That's so I am a consequentialist, but the human face aspect comes in with the fact that I don't think consequentialism means that you make every decision on an ad hoc basis, looking at just the particular circumstance. I don't think it makes you, in that sense, a situationist. Consistently with thinking that the right is determined by what's for the good overall, you need to be concerned with the practice within which you're operating, if it's a case like the criminal justice case, or the sorts of goods like friendship that are disposition dependent and that only get produced if you act out of the right disposition, that you can't produce if you calculate about outcomes. So that means that you've got to, being a consequentialist is a very demanding intellectually thing to work out exactly what it requires of you. But it is not ad hoc situationism. That's what I want to emphasize.
Very good. Yeah, that's a great answer. And part of your response there made me think of a paper from Michael Stalker from some time ago on the schizophrenia of modern ethical theories.
Very good.
Yeah. I wanted to ask.
Sorry, could I just say?
Yeah, for sure.
Michael Stalker was a colleague of mine in Australia, as he is now in the United States, and I was very early made aware of Michael's views, which I just think his stuff is really interesting. It was in response to that stuff, though, that I developed this notion of a red light, You don't have to be, he says that you become schizophrenic, if on the one hand you're looking to the best outcomes, but on the other hand, you've got these inclinations. I want to say you can be consequentialist and not be schizophrenic and not be schizoid, not be divided in two minds in that way. Just go with the inclinations, but be on alert for red lights.
Very good. Very good. So I'll end with one more question and then we can wrap up. So a couple months ago, we were very happy to have Stanley Fish as a guest. And one view that he was sympathetic to, that I take it you're very much not sympathetic to, was, and here I'm quoting, that philosophy itself has no consequences, that it does not travel beyond the philosophy seminar, and that the answers you give to philosophical questions will say nothing about how you live your life. What would you say in response to this sort of claim?
Oh, I just think that's wrong. I mean, there are two extreme views here. One is, you might describe his view as quietism, that philosophy just stays in the office, stays in the seminar room. It has no effect. It doesn't ripple outside. And some things Hume once wrote a bit like that when he says that we stop worrying about causation when we play backgammon or whatever, even though as philosophers we worry a lot about it. The other extreme is sort of, I think, of Jean-Paul Sartre, is the existentialist extreme. That is where every moment of ordinary life is, so to speak, rife with the anxiety of the reflective philosopher. I don't think that's quite right either. But I certainly think that you need to, and I certainly hope I do, bring my philosophy home from the office, so to speak. In the sense that we talked about free will at the beginning. And to me, for example, it's really important that I think free will is real. I think it's really important to me that it represents, as I think of it, an internalization of the social activity of exhortation of others. I think that general view, I have a book actually, if I may do a bit of advertising, called When Minds Speak, The Social Nature of Our Mental Life, which Oxford will be publishing next year, I think. I gave them as the Locke lectures in Oxford a couple of years back. I argue there that we are essentially social creatures, and that when we conduct our mental life, as in, for example, do I have free will? Should I do this or not? We're often internalizing what we've learned to do socially with one another. Now, I think for me, the shift to that way of thinking was like a massive sort of land shift. The whole perspective changed for me. And I think I value every moment of interaction with other people. I value social life together, in a way that I never would have without that sort of particular line that I take on the nature of mental and social life, are moving towards the freedom discussion that we had. I mean, for me, the way of thinking about freedom as non-domination is really important politically and in the public world. And if I may say, for example, the then Prime Minister of Spain, Zapatero, in 2004, adopted the Republican approach and invited me actually initially to be an advisor, but then I couldn't do that because he also invited me to review his government. He invited me in public in Spain at an event for how far his government had lived up to the Republican principles before the next election, which was due in 2008. And I said to him, I can't be an advisor if I'm the reviewer. But he really put into place a range of policies which were directly sort of derived from the larger Republican tradition, of which I saw myself as just one of a number of spokespersons. There are lots of others too. I mean, prominent amongst them at the time still is, of course, is Quentin Skinner, the historian. But he drew on that tradition to evolve a whole range of policies. So, for example, Spain, Catholic country though it is, was the third legislature in the world that introduced same-sex marriage. And in introducing it, he actually used the eyeball test. Speaking to Parliament, he said, which of you can leave this room and expect someone homosexual to look you in the eye without a reason for fear of deference? More or less, this is what he said. If you are going to say to them, your intimate relationships are not worthy of the same civic and political and legal recognition as our heterosexual relationships are. And, there was massive opposition when he introduced this bill in the first place, even within his own party. By the time it passed in 2005, I think, it had 65% support in Spain, despite massive concerted opposition by the Catholic hierarchy, for example. So I think that's a testament to how philosophy can move into, not just through personal life, but into the public life that we share together.
That's very interesting. I mean, I know there's a lot of stuff there and other stuff you've written on that I'd like to explore as well. But we don't have all day. Is there you mentioned a forthcoming book there. Is there anything else that sort of current projects or something else that you've published that you'd like to advertise or?
Well, that's very kind of you. I think I continue to work both in political philosophy and philosophy of mind. In political philosophy, I do have a book that's due out in a year or two with Princeton University Press on the state, the nature of the state, which I think hasn't been given enough attention within political philosophy itself. And then with Oxford University Press, and these lectures I gave, that's called When Minds Speak, The Social Nature of Our Mental Life, subtitle. And those are the two things that are very live at the moment for me.
Very good. So with that, we'll draw the questions to the end. Thank you so much for being here, taking all this time to consider our questions and provide some very detailed and thoughtful responses. It's been excellent to have you.
That was a real pleasure. Thank you, Troy. I'm sorry for being so loquacious, but Yeah, there you are. I suppose it's part of being a philosopher. Thank you very much.